Early Marx 101 is the next big Philosophy Portal course. The course starts June 9th and will unfold throughout the rest of 2025. The course will include 7 lectures on the early Marx's writings from 1840s and include discussions and Q&A opportunities, indefinite access to recordings, as well as special access to portal sessions related to Marxism, capitalism, and socialism. Philosophy Portal courses also lead to opportunities to learn presentation skills and writing opportunities at our conferences and anthologies. Work at this theopolitical edge on these topics is more important than ever, and without engagement with the specific historical contradictions that appear at the site of modern democracy and industrial capitalism, we'll be unable to address or adequately engage with them. To learn more about the Early Marx 101 course or to sign up, visit philosophyportal.online. And the man, the myth, the legend, Chris Cutrone. Drum roll. Chris, are you with us?
I am. Hello.
How are you doing, sir?
Good. Good.
Well, it's good to see you. We're here for the last session. So, Chris, we don't have much time with you, so let's make the most of it. Real talk. I think what would be great is the title we chose for this, Society and Marxism Today and Tomorrow. I think having a forward-looking view on the month, just sort of what are we taking away
Mm-hmm.
from this seminar series with you.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, I have a question that I'd like to ask as an opening before opening it up to everyone else. And I
Okay.
think by the looks of everyone here, we're going to be able to all sort of offer a reflection. We should be able to get that in within 2 hours. But I sort of also want to invite you, if there's any opening reflection you have for us in terms of thinking about society and Marxism today and tomorrow, we can start with that, and then I'll ask a question, and then we'll just open up the circle.
All right. So I suppose that in terms of like zooming out and taking a kind of synoptic view, um, there is the question of, and this is again from kind of classical social theory, the criterion of plausibility. And so what makes Marxism plausible? What made it plausible in its moment? Why did Marx and Engels think the thoughts that they did? But also, why did it catch on as a mass movement? Why did it become such a powerful ideology historically when it did? And then why are we still haunted by it? And so the idea is that there must be some relationship between social being and consciousness, even if they're not identical, and even if at times there are, not only tensions, but indeed contradictions between social being and consciousness. So I think that one of the formulations that I have in the book is, so long as we live in capitalism, we will be haunted by Marxism. And so long as we're living in capitalism, we are regenerating bourgeois social relations, and therefore the aspirations for freedom that are engendered by those bourgeois social relations, despite the fact that they are contradicted by the industrial forces of production. So we're haunted by both utopia and dystopia. And one of the problems with Marxism is that it's sort of associated with both, meaning original historical Marxism can seem painfully optimistic and utopian to us, but it is also associated with its results in a real historical dystopia, including, not just in certain countries, but more generally. So that's why, the right today in a place like the United States has to imagine that America is being undermined by some insidious Marxist influence. That they associate the dystopian character of capitalism and the threat of dystopia with Marxism. So Marxism itself embodies this contradiction, although in a different way now than it originally did. So it originally tried to grasp contradictions within the proletarian socialist movement, within the workers' movement for socialism, in the development of its struggle. But now Marxism seems more caught in the contradiction of capitalism itself. Now, I will also remind us that in the early 20th century, people like Max Weber and Heidegger and others, Carl Schmitt, other kind of fascist thinkers, they associated Marxism with bourgeois society and capitalism. So they had a kind of an undialectical view that bourgeois society had led into capitalism, and that all that socialism was a kind of um, barbarized version of capitalism. So also the ordo liberals had this kind of idea that what socialism would be like the worst aspects of capitalism brought out and instantiated and enforced. So the fact that Marxism, and again, there are more radical ideologies that thought, Marxism is not radical enough. It's too compromised by these kind of bourgeois values, bourgeois assumptions about like the Enlightenment and labor and production, society in this respect, at the expense of other, there's like radical right and radical left discontents with Marxism. The radical right tends to say that Marxism is an even worse version of bourgeois society and capitalism, and forgetting ancient truths and wisdom. The radical left tends to try to, go beyond Marxism, tends to engage in attempts at a kind of a post-Marxism or a kind of a non-Marxism or an anti-Marxist view of freedom from capitalism, even if they don't cast it as freedom from capitalism. That's the aspiration. So all these things, so for me, Marxism today in 2025, Marxism is a symptom. It's not a solution, it's not an answer, but it's a problem and a question. It's a symptom. And my writings that, you guys have been reading, that we've gone through in this course, were the product of me trying to remind a generation that was reaching back to Marxism, the millennials, of just how strange Marxism might be from our contemporary point of view. So in that respect, I wanted to, kind of brush history against the grain, remind us of things that have fallen out and have been forgotten in Marxism, and really try to get at just how thick the problem and the question really is, how thick the symptom is. And so, to use a kind of Freudian metaphor, a more self-conscious symptom holds more hope than a more unconscious symptom, a more kind of acting out symptom. So Marxism, unfortunately, runs the entire gamut, that whole spectrum. So sometimes Marxism is completely unconscious and acting out in its character, and sometimes it's very self-conscious and aware, even if it ends up being kind of paralyzed as a result of that, in a kind of neurotic sense of paralysis. Now, I tend to be associated with that. I tend to be associated with kind of quietism, abstentionism, a kind of paralyzed by theory, like, oh, Chris Cutrone will just have us like lost in this esoteric Marxism forever and unable to act. And so I'm this sort of, I'm seen as the diametrical opposite of the people who are like, enough thinking, let's act. Enough talking, let's do something. Right. So of course, I think, again, that the more self-conscious, even if apparently more paralyzed thoughts that occur when considering Marxism are the deeper and more important ones to consider and to kind of pause upon, tarry with. But I also know that people are motivated to try to change the world in a more immediate sense. And so, yeah, putting these ideas out there, it sort of exposes one, to all sorts of misapprehensions, accusations, etc. And that's, what I've, in my more political writings, in my more contemporary commentary, I've opened myself up to be a projection screen for all sorts of things, from right, left, center, but particularly from the left. Yeah, so that's how
Great.
I'd introduce us.
That's perfect. And I think that that opening really helps me re acknowledge sort of why I'm attracted to your work. So, on a personal note, I think I am like an archetype of a millennial leftist in a very like caricatured way. Like you check all the boxes of a typical North American millennial leftist. Even though I ended up going to Europe, for me, I also want to identify some other places of commonality between you know my work and I feel like what you're doing, which is my starting point was watching, not an absolute starting point, but a key starting point for me was this sort of emphasis of like a Zizekian meme where he's saying, don't act, just think. And I was like, I felt that resonated with me in 2016,
Hmm.
in part because I remember giving a really embarrassing presentation, like retroactively, like an embarrassing Marxist presentation where I was like too overly activist and
Hmm.
too much trying to change the world in where it gets into that cringy territory. And I was like, okay, no, I've really gotta drink this philosophy medicine or poison, however you want to think about it. And that did take me to Hegel, and that
Hmm.
did take me to thought and emphasizing thought. And I just think there's such an interesting, you could call it symptom between Hegel and Marx that I really do think is important to tarry with. And you're saying, Marxism is a problem and a question as opposed to an answer or a solution. And to me, that does bring out the philosophical dimension of Marxism. What are we philosophically thinking about Marxism? And also, I want, and we can stay with Freud instead of Lacan. There's no issue with that for me, but Marxism is a symptom,
Yeah.
which brings out a psychoanalytic dimension to things. And so, my question for you is what seems to me the key in your work, millennial left is dead. I very much identify as an archetype of a millennial leftist, and I've found myself in a kind of undead state since like 2016. So when I ask the question, how should the millennial left think about resurrection? Is that a meaningful question to you? Because I know in your work and actually in the prologue or the preamble of Marxism
Hmm.
and Politics, you do kind of say there was an optimism that you found in the millennial left, but at the same time, that's kind of over now, and you feel like that millennial left isn't going to act in the way that you thought they might be able to act at a certain
Right.
moment. And so I find myself in the aftermath of that situation you're identifying, and at the same time, I still do find myself actively working with capitalism, which means re-engendering bourgeois social relations,
Hmm.
and I find myself still kind of terrorized by the unfolding apocalypse of industrial revolutions, which in their purported discourse point towards some sort of singularitarian notion, which brings us to this problem of freedom and existential collapse. So, yeah, that's basically my question. How should the millennial left think about resurrection given that context I'm setting?
I mean, where I am, so I have sort of, I would say I have two kind of frameworks that I approach this with. And it gets to this question of like, potential rebirth, or resurrection. I think it would be more a rebirth or a second life. Which is, I think that the millennial left sort of took a detour, a kind of predictable detour, a kind of almost inevitable detour, but nonetheless a detour into progressive liberalism, into progressive capitalism, into Bernie and Corbyn momentum in the UK, into Syriza Podemos, Spain and Greece, into I don't know DM25, Yanis Varoufakis's, like into these things, right? And you know what else was there for them to do, right? Now, you mentioned 2016, so I declared the millennial left dead in 2017 because I felt like I gave it a good 10 years,
Yeah,
and it just
that
so
was around
happened,
that something changed then, though. Something changed.
yeah, Trump was elected, and of course now we're back, right? Now we're back, and so I think that it's so the theory and the practice are separated to something that we talked about last time. I think that I mentioned also that some readers of, Gillian Rose, when they discovered my essay on Gillian Rose that's included in the book, they liked it, but then were extremely frustrated that for them, I just resolved it as like a Marxist practicism, where I was like, oh, well, she's forgetting the practice of the proletarian socialist movement. She's forgetting the party. And they're just like, oh, that's what Marxists always say. They always say practice, practice, practice. But I do think that these things are separated. I don't think that there's like a Marxist practice to be had. I don't really think there's a proper Marxist theory. There's a kind of a spectral kind of presence at a theoretical level for Marxism. But the practice is not really Marxist or even necessarily very rigorously socialist to begin with. So that's another side of me, is that in terms of what is to be done. So I have set myself the task of trying to give the millennials who are, burnt out and who have jacked themselves up on these ideas and have found themselves at this impasse at this point, the possibility of a second life. And that's the campaign for a socialist party. I started more than 10 years ago. No, about 10 years ago now. Yeah, 2015, and almost exactly 10 years ago. It had its ups and downs. It had a hiatus around COVID. And now the question is, okay, do you want to do something else? Right. And rather than just become cranky, wise old men, pseudo pedagogues, like miseducators of youth, right, to the millennials, like, do you want to be the next generation of miseducators of youth like I encountered with the baby boom generation in the aftermath of the New Left in the 80s and 90s? Or do you want to actually contribute something better? And I have as an example my mentor Adolf Fried, who did his Labor Party project in the 90s and really was very hostile to ideological Marxism in that context. And I always thought he should have done the same kind of activity, but more with a socialist rather than a Labor Party parameter and goal, although that would affect the activity as well. So I do have that going on, and I do have that frame of reference in the background for me. And so it is a question of, there was a moment of reconsideration of Marxism in the height of the millennial left that was abandoned as more or less irrelevant for a progressive capitalist reform effort, which is what I understand the DSA to have done and Bernieism to have done. That also, reached its limits, which I predicted, because there just isn't, in capitalist politics, there really isn't a constituency for it. And so it's just, it's not that it couldn't happen. It's not like there are any objective aspects of capitalism that could prevent progressive reforms, but there isn't a political will for it in capitalist politics. And socialists should not try to provide that, because it has a very different goal. So again, the old-fashioned Marxism that I'm trying to recall would forbid that path as a viable path for building a proletarian socialist movement. So I think that there's that. There's also the question of, okay, what about the basic assumptions, more basic than Marxism? So that's another aspect at an intellectual level. Is, you mentioned Hegel. Is there again, just a moment of reflection where we abandon all the assumptions that we have, both from the historical left, like the 20th century left. So Daniel Tutt said to me, I agree with you, Chris, the 20th century left is dead. Right? So not just the millennial left, the 20th century left. Okay, Stalinism, that's what that is. Stalinism and its kind of, dissidence around the edges of it, like kind of neo-anarchism and that kind of stuff. So okay, so where does that leave you? So Benjamin Studebaker, I'll raise him as another interlocutor of mine. He says, well, Chris, you want to go back to the 19th century, but we can't do that. And it's like, well, but we never left it. I think we talked about that. We never left the 19th century. The problem is that the 20th century thought that it had left the 19th century. It had not, and we still have not. The snag there is that we might think neoliberalism is some kind of, return to the 19th century, and that's not exactly right either. But really, we have to get back in touch with some just basic, like bourgeois society, modern theory of politics and society, like classical social theory, classical sociology, classical political philosophy, because those things are still rattling around and the right will reach for them and some people on the left will reach for them. And
Inter-
so
yeah.
before Marxism, is there something else for us to sort of get back in touch with? Again, going
Yeah.
back to what I started with, the plausibility. So, Marxism is more or less plausible. What I've discovered in teaching the millennial left is that actually people got very enchanted, my students got very enchanted by the bourgeois philosophy, by Rousseau, Adam Smith, Kant, Hegel. They got very enchanted. Like that was the profound insight that was clear to them in a way that Marxism was kind of like, we're not quite sure what it's about. We're not sure what they're really talking about because there is a missing object, a proletarian socialist movement in society that's bound up with the development of capitalism in its own time. So the bourgeois thought was much more compelling. I think there's a guy, Dave on Sublation, who's a patron, and he's an ex-Trotskyist, and he said that he was blown away just by reading Rousseau. That it felt like Rousseau described the consciousness of the working class more directly than Marxism did. Okay, right? So plausibility. To me, what this all says, again from classical social theory, is that if these ideas are still plausible, then they have a basis in reality. And so there might be some, we might have to fill in that, underlying set of assumptions. The way I've taught that stuff is what did Marx read? What were Marx's assumptions? And yes, he read a lot of Greeks and Romans. He did. But no, I'm talking about in the modern era. Like, what are his assumptions? What was his bookshelf of 18th century, 1700s, and early 19th century, right? Yeah, sure. Plato, Aristotle, sure, right? Democritus, Epicurus, sure. But no, what about Rousseau? What about Adam Smith? What about Kant and Hegel? What about other Enlightenment thinkers? What about that? Because it didn't save them, but the 20th century also knew that it was there, right? So, like the Frankfurt School knew that it was there, for instance, but also many others knew that it was there as well and struggled with it. So my big fear is that, the 20th century is dead. It comes back in the zombie form. So the undead character, Cadell, that you mentioned, right? The
And in
zombie.
Kirsty's brilliant art,
What do you
the
mean?
the art that I sent you, I think you saw it. The left is dead with the zombies.
Oh, of course. Yeah. The zombies. Yeah, in that sense, that's right. Like the kind of horror movie poster. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So okay, but if it's undead, then what's the lifeblood that's missing? I mean, finally, I'll say something about Trump. What the left fails to do, the right will do instead. It's a basic lesson of history. The right is nothing but an
Yeah.
expression of the failure of the left. And again, if we just think of the left not in terms of like progressivism, progressive capitalism, progressive liberalism, not what they fail to do, but no, what the missing socialist left, right? What tasks are going to be taken up? What history is going to be remembered? But in this kind of bizarre way, in this very opportunistic, unself-conscious, and also like an acting kind of way, like this kind of weird symptomatic way, right? So it's a that's where I feel like Trump is just an opportunistic politician, but then he has around him this attempt to think through the moment by the right. And that's another parallel symptom. There's a millennial right.
Yep. The one thing I want to add here to get like provoke your thinking a little bit is that same time for me around 2016 as the Trump, which was a key thing for me, like becoming sort of undead leftist, is actually you're saying here about the right-wing millennials. To me, the greatest intellectual symptom of that is Jordan Peterson. And what Jordan Peterson says is, I'm a classical liberal.
He's the parallel to Zizek, isn't he?
He is.
He's the teacher of the millennials, who's the parallel, who's the same generational cohort.
To me,
Uh,
yeah.
but
But
I
right
also
wing.
think, yeah, very right wing, and I mean Zizek's right wing in his own way, but I'll leave that aside. We'll just use the nominal left, nominal right. But uh, but I'm thinking more like the millennials themselves, like these James Lindsays and Christopher Rufos. And I was watching something on Unheard, this guy, NS Lyons, who's a Straussian, right? Who's like this kind of pseudo sage, kind of young man, old man. He's got a beard and he talks like he's 20 years older than he is. And I'm just like, get over yourself, man. Fucking Leo Strauss, no. You know? And it all goes back to liberalism and Hobbes, and he wants to demasculinize society and all this crap. And I'm like, oh man, like this is what's going to take the place of actual thought on the left, right? So I do think, so again, I feel that, okay, so with Trump, so the missing pieces, right? The missing pieces. I think we need to get back to basics about what society is, what politics is in this society and capitalism. And why do they invoke these things? Like, why are people mulling the Constitution in the US? Like, why are they wondering about, like, what the hell did the founding fathers think creating this presidency that now we have to deal with in Trump? But just like very, very basic things, just getting all the over elaborate stuff, just tearing all that away and just getting really just basic, fundamental about it. And recognizing, again, insofar as we still live in bourgeois society, we still live with some actual structures, practices of bourgeois society. We do. I mean, yes, they're corrupted and they're encrusted and they're hamstrung by capitalism and they're compromised in all sorts of ways, but they're there. And I do think, the advantage is that we're not dealing with it through like fascism or something. We're not dealing with it through a complete unconscious delusionary consciousness. We're not. We're dealing with like Donald Trump reading the Constitution and saying, oh, what can I do as president? And finding support for that. So it is time for us to just throw out a lot of leftist assumptions and just get back to basics. Like, okay, what are we assuming that might be misleading us? What are we assuming that might be blinding us?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Well,
I've gotten
look,
into trouble for
that
that too.
answer. Well, no, you get accused of quietism. I think probably that's my own self-critique, and that came up in our conversation a little bit, that you get accused of quietism. But you know what? Your response kind of just what it does for me is it provides me with a little more confidence that actually the path I'm taking is probably the right one, in terms of I'm at that phase of questioning assumptions and going back to basics. And so, I'm just going to follow that path. So, again, I'll open it up to the rest of the circle now, but I just want to sort of state I've really appreciated this engagement with the portal and your work, and yeah, looking forward to continue thinking with you. So, this has been a clip from the portal. For the full session, you can get access either by becoming a member of the portal or by registering to the Early Marx 101 course. Early Marx 101 is the next big philosophy portal course. The course starts June 9th and will unfold throughout the rest of 2025. The course will include 7 lectures on the early Marx's writings from 1840s and include discussions and Q&A opportunities, indefinite access to recordings, as well as special access to portal sessions related to Marxism, capitalism, and socialism. Philosophy Portal courses also lead to opportunities to learn presentation skills and writing opportunities at our conferences and anthologies. Work at this theopolitical edge on these topics is more important than ever, and without engagement with the specific historical contradictions that appear at the site of modern democracy and industrial capitalism, we'll be unable to address or adequately engage with them. To learn more about the Early Marx 101 course or to sign up, Visit philosophyportal.online. The portal is a living, thinking community. Becoming a member of the portal gives you access to 4 live events every month, but more importantly, an opportunity to learn how to think with others, to learn with online creators and para academics, and to develop your own capacity as a philosopher. Becoming a member of the portal also gives you access to the history of our recordings, as well as discount access on past and future courses. This year, members also get exclusive access to the Slovenian School Reading Group, as well as the year-long course focused on Deleuze and analysis. To learn more or to sign up, visit philosophyportal.online.